What's up, comrades? Welcome to this week's episode of Red Library, a political education podcast for today's left. We're here for Plowin with McGowan, Chapter 6, Part 6. Along the way to our recording night, we lost a couple of good comrades, so we'd like to start off this episode by saying R.I.P. CC Alex and R.I.P. Comrade Jared. They got murked by the deep state, by a bunch of Delusians on the way to the recording, and so we were left with the skeleton crew of yours truly, Comrade Adam / Chairman Bane, CC Don, and Comrade Neil. In Chapter 6, CC Don is in the driver's seat, and we're going to be talking about McGowan's very well-known work on the philosopher Hegel. This episode is going to focus on Hegel's concepts of the good infinite, the bad infinite, and finitude as it relates to capitalism and desire. We're also going to talk a little bit about breakfast foods, and there's going to be some contentious discussion about McGowan's interpretation of Marx. So lots of HQC, high-quality content coming your way. Let's run down the various ways you can support Red Library and the work we are doing here week in and week out. If you'd like to become a patron of the show, head over to patreon.com. That's www.patreon.com/Red Library Podcast. And for as little as $1 a month, that is less than a quarter an episode, you can get access to our exclusive Discord server where you can talk about movies, books, more than likely get invited to participate on an episode of Red Library, roundtable discussions, movie nights, and all sorts of other good stuff. Remember to like the show on Facebook, follow us on Twitter. If you're listening on iTunes, please continue to go down and give us one of those star reviews. That is helping us find more and more potential Comrade listeners all over the globe. And as we are building a leftist podcasting guerrilla army, we need as many people as we can get. Allegedly. I don't want to have someone from the deep state come and knock on my door tomorrow. Remember that Red Library is part of the Lost Horizons podcasting network, a collection of shows focused on developing the dialectical pessimist perspective. That includes us, our Podrades over at the Regrettable Century, and From 78. Remember, we have a monthly roundtable discussion with a varying cast of characters from all the shows talking about all sorts of things related to politics, philosophy, psychoanalysis, and all that other good stuff. You can find a link for that in the show notes, or just search on your favorite podcasting app. Well, here we are still, after all. Here we go with Plowin with McGowan, Part 6. It's Hegel time, bitches. We'll catch you back here next week. Same Red Library time, same Red Library place. That doesn't make any sense. Enjoy the episode. Peace. And on that note, let's start the episode with that sentiment. You can never be too unprepared, as we are going to be for Plowin with McGowan, Chapter 6, Part 6. It's me, Comrade Adam. It's just three of us here tonight, so it's me, Chairman Bane / Comrade Adam. Who dis?
It's CC Don, working with the skeleton crew tonight.
Well, yeah, it was skeleton crew, yeah, late night crew.
And this is Neil. Hi, I'm here, saying things into a microphone.
He is. That's what he's doing. Neil is graced us with his presence in the midst of a fucking nightmare of a semester and babies and everything else. So we're lucky to all be here. Here we are still, after all.
I've been looking forward to this.
Yeah, we had to reschedule, and now we're we still lost a couple of the crew, but we're here.
Exactly.
Yeah. Do you notice I'm shoehorning in the here we are still after all into like every episode I can now?
I noticed a lot of them. I didn't realize it was every episode.
I'm trying to like cross promote across multiple platforms, synergize.
Yeah.
The tenants, hands interlinked. Neil, did you see Tenet yet? Have you had the time to see a movie?
No. Well, I've been watching movies at home, but I have not gone to a movie theater in how long it's been at this point. It's been a really, really long time, which is a shame because that's like one of those things that I really liked doing a lot, and it's something that I frequently miss in this weird time of like I don't know, whatever we would call this, the time of COVID. I think of movies as things that existed in the land before, and I wonder what the fate of movies is going to be like, coming up. I heard Amazon be buying like Regal.
Really? I didn't hear that.
So who knows what's happening there.
Wow. We're only going to have Amazon run movie theaters. There's going to be no more cruise lines. So at least some positive changes.
Have you seen Tenet? Why did you ask?
Yeah, we went to see it. We actually went to an Alamo Draft House. They had a screening where it's like, they had all the seating spaced out. But yeah, it's not good. I don't recommend going to see it or anything. I was just
very
curious.
Distinctly not good.
It was decidedly bad. But anyway, we were making a joke about there's like this thing they do in the movie where they like put their hands together like this to signify time flowing like forwards and then time flowing backwards and them overlapping. I don't know.
Temporal pincer movement.
Yeah, it's a temporal pincer movement that you represent by putting your hands together like this. It was very dumb, but we're trying to turn it into a joke now.
And that's been merged with the Blade Runner 2049 cells interlinked.
Oh yeah. So we're yeah. Yeah.
Hold on a second. Are you guys talking shit about 2049 right now? Blade Runner 2049 is a beautiful film.
No, I love 2049.
We were just saying that there's like the phrase in there that's like cells interlinked.
Yeah, from Nabokov.
Yeah, when he's doing his Voight Kampf test.
Yeah,
But yeah, for whatever reason, I think when we were all drinking one time
and recording an episode.
Yeah, we started in reference to Tenet doing the hand signs, and it also became hands interlinked instead of cells interlinked. I don't know. We're explaining this joke that actually makes no coherence whatsoever.
Yeah, we were very incoherent when we made the joke. Yeah. Anyway, that was
maybe not worth talking about.
I'll probably cut out most of this, to be honest. All right. Chapter 6, let's do it. We're going to try to speed run this mofo. It's the Skeleton Crew. It is the shortest chapter as of yet. Right? Was it like 20 pages? Less than 20 pages?
Yeah,
something like that?
Let's say 20. I'm not going to check.
And even though it is the shortest chapter, I feel like the ideas in this chapter are great. You know, this is a really short, but I think excellently written chapter where McGowan talks about the infinite as a concept and the differences between the good infinite and the bad infinite in ways that are very understandable, easy to kind of like get your mind around and then kind of like digest, think about, and hopefully for us talk about.
Well, as could be expected, I'll have a lot of questions. So.
Don has many questions as per usual.
I will say this is a very Hegel heavy chapter compared to the Lacan heavy chapters that we had previous.
Maybe the heaviest Hegelian chapter as of yet. Yeah, so Neil, you really dug this chapter? You liked it?
I did.
Have you read his book on Hegel?
I haven't read that one. No, it came out like kind of when I had a lot of other stuff going on in life, so I bought the book. And I think I read like maybe the first 2 chapters, and then like I had to answer an email, and then I was hungry, so I ate a bagel, and one thing led to another, and I completely forgot about the book.
I thought you were going to say you woke up naked in an alley or something like that. It's like, listen, I ate a bagel, I blacked out, smoked meth in an alley, I don't know what happened.
I thought that the bagel was going to remind you of the good infinite, and you're going to get like a
holy
French
shit
toast stick to remind you of the bad or the fine. I don't know. Anyway.
Oh, you should try to explain the concepts through bagels and French toast.
I'm not going to do that.
Okay, that's right.
So I actually was going to start with a question, though, because really early on in this chapter, there's something that struck me, and I was just kind of curious what both of you thought about this. I'm going to see if I can actually find the exact line here. It's really early. I think it's the second paragraph of the chapter where McGowan says, what makes Hegel the capitalist philosopher inclusive of Marx is his conception of infinity. Mm-hmm. And it's that inclusive of Marx that I wanted to ask both of you about. Having read the chapter, having read a lot of Marx, would you agree, disagree with that statement? What are your thoughts on that?
So I think at the end he gets into like the longer discussion of Marx. I know we definitely intended on talking about that part. Do you want to talk about it now, or do you want to wait till we get to the chapter?
Well, I mean, I feel like this whole chapter is set up as sort of a polemic about Hegel being in some ways like a much more revolutionary starting point than Marx himself, and seeing Marx as actually almost in a way like a misstep from Hegel's dialectic itself. I mean, I've said this on past episodes. I don't agree with McGowan's reading of Marx. I think I read Marx very differently, and so I would take issue with his reading of Marx. But also, I mean, there's an active debate still to this day about how much you can really separate Marx's method from Hegel himself. So I think you could kind of look at this 2 ways. One, either, you look at it as McGowan's reading of Marx and how much that actually seems to line up with Marx and like how other people read Marx. Well, in addition to that, you could also say, okay, but can you really find a clean breaking point of like Marx separating himself from Hegel in the way that I think some people still kind of, I think, read him that way. But again, I mean, that's an active debate as well. So yeah, I mean, I don't know. I think it's I don't know if I would say it's a hot take on Marx, because I think he is trying to ground it pretty heavily, and it's not the most off the cuff thing, but yeah, I don't know. I just find it to be a pretty limited reading of Marx personally. Don, Neil, what do y'all think?
I wanted to press you on that a little bit. So how would you describe McGowan's reading of Marx? And if you wouldn't, where do you think his reading maybe diverges from your own?
Sure.
What's the difference there?
Yeah, so I think that in my reading of this chapter in particular, and listening to McGowan talk about Marx and why he doesn't call himself a Marxist pretty extensively in interviews, he seems to always lean on two key readings. One, in this chapter in particular, he reads Marx in the framework of what was typically called like Marx being Promethean, which is this idea that the development of productive forces like can somehow lead to like unending technological progress. I think that is maybe the case up to the Communist Manifesto, but there's really serious in-depth scholarship that Marx actually changed his opinion on that pretty heavily, and he changed it pretty fast in the early 1850s. So I don't think that's like a very good and representative reading of Marx's thought sort of as a whole. And I guess I would say the other thing is that like McGowan has said repeatedly that he thinks that Marx's vision of like communist society sees an end to contradiction. I just don't really understand like where he's drawing that from. I mean, to me, I think sometimes I'm not sure if McGowan is talking about like Marx or people who were Marxists, especially in the Second International, which they did kind of think like that. Like they did really, like Bernstein and like even Kautsky to some degree, like they did see this idea that like capital's production and its sort of internal contradictions were going to like eventually lead to communism, and it would resolve contradictions maybe in a way. I don't know. I mean, I'm not really sure who McGowan is leveling that critique at. I mean, again, my reading of Marx isn't like 100% exhaustive, but it's pretty thorough. And I just don't really kind of see exactly where he's grounding that from. Yeah, I don't know, Neil. I mean, what do you think?
I think that what McGowan is getting at is that Hegel has this idea that, within constraint, there is an infinite kind of like number of possibilities, right? But there are constraints. He doesn't sort of like disavow constraints. He doesn't act as if those constraints are not there. That the system has to be a closed system, and within that closed system there are an infinite number of possibilities. But the infinite number of possibilities kind of like exist because of constraints in a weird way, and I like that. I don't even know exactly why I like that, but I know what I do. I think that through, and I'm like, that just seems to make sense in my head. It sounds right. I dig it, and I'm not sure if I get this right or not. I'd be curious for you to tell me if you think my thinking is on or off here. The way that Marx's, I think, conception of history kind of plays out, the various moves from feudalism to the rise of the bourgeoisie and capitalism to socialism to eventually communism. The idea of communism in particular just seems to be like, in a sense, like limitless potential, like limitless human awesomeness all the time. And that's one of those things that when I hear that's it's the beef that I have with like generally like kind of utopian thinking, that idea. And that's how I think maybe he's reading Marx. But like I said, I'd be really curious to see if that is what you're both getting from this, or maybe I'm kind of imposing some of my own thoughts and ideas and preconceptions onto this.
I mean, it's a good question. My first thought would be that in a way to read it that way is to read Marx as if they were the utopian socialists that they were critiquing as scientific socialists. I think that in a way, like, the whole reason to call it scientific socialism in the first place was to ground it in not this sort of, utopian style thinking. Again, I think very early Marx maybe had that tendency, but again, I think that shifted pretty rapidly. I mean, Neil, I don't know if you've like heard this, but we did an episode on Kohei Saito's Karl Marx's Eco-Socialism, and like that whole book is really Saito's project to destroy that reading of Marx. I mean, I think it's kind of twofold. I think that recent publications of Marx's collected works like have definitely helped to support like a different understanding of Marx's reading, or like Marx's conception of like progress and technological development and such. But I do think that like even a long time ago, like even in his journalistic work about like India and colonialism and stuff, to me, I think I have a hard time seeing that in Marx, like reading Marx like post-communist manifesto through his more like political writings in the 1850s up. And I mean, I don't even think you could really find it in Capital, like volume 1 per se. So, I mean, that's my read. Actually, Neil, you did bring up something really interesting though, and I wanted to ask you this. Whenever you were talking about limits, how there is like infinite potentiality within certain limits, it actually reminds me of how you've talked about the symbolic before, and like the way that the law not only sort of like limits, but it also provides possibilities. And I'm curious, do you feel like that's kind of part of why that idea appeals to you, is kind of maybe there's a connection there to the symbolic?
That sounds right when you say it. I hadn't thought that, but listening to you put that together, my own sort of subjective reaction to that is like, yeah, Yeah, that sounds right.
Okay,
I like
cool. I'm gonna put in our little ding buzzer behind that.
Yeah, it sounds good. I really dig it. Interesting though, because I've been listening to some of the more recent episodes of Why Theory where they talk the real, the symbolic, and the imaginary, which are great. I really like what they're doing there. And in those, I think that the symbolic seem to be in some sense maybe like privileged or kind of like the hero of the three. Even though I think at one point something like the real is the hero, but I'm like, I don't know. I think that they're maybe talking about the symbolic as a hero. So yeah, that's interesting. I kind of want to keep thinking about it. Really, that's what I really like about this chapter, is that it has so many moments that I'm like, I just kind of want to keep thinking about that.
I'll tell you what, I want to put you on the hook for having a discussion at some point around privileging specific registers, because I do wonder about that sometimes, like which one we kind of tend to lean more towards or privilege. Why is it that we lean towards one versus the other? So I've always wondered if kind of like the symbolic was the one that I always feel like you kind of have like really had a lot of fascination with. So at some point I'd like to talk more about that as you think about it.
Yeah, I'd like to do that too. I think it'd be a fun conversation for me to talk more about that, because the real is like the sexy register right now. That's the one that everybody's, I think, really kind of taken with at the moment. And I think a lot of that has to do with the work that Zizek is doing and that Alenka Zupancic is doing as well. I think that has a huge influence on the way that people think about this. But also the work in the Lacanian schools right now is very focused on the real, because they're focusing so much on the late Lacan, the latest stuff he was doing, towards the end of his life, and really trying to do more with that. And I could go down that rabbit hole, but that would take us super far away from this McGowan text. And I don't want to do. Well, I do want to do that, but I also don't. So I'll try to obey the part of me that doesn't want to do that. I'll be good.
You gave ground relative to your desire, Neil. Come on. I'm going to pose a question then, just to get us really knee deep into the chapter. Explain to me good and bad infinite, or I will fucking kill you. Go.
So, okay. So that's how this chapter starts off, with a discussion of Hegel's good and bad infinite. I think that the short version is, we can imagine the bad infinite as like a line that goes on forever, as just a series of endless events, whereas the good event is, we can imagine a circle. Let me have this reading from 137, about the middle of the page. As true infinite, bent back upon itself, its image becomes the circle, the line that has reached itself, closed and wholly present, without beginning and end. This idea of self-limitation or exclusion of its own limit allows Hegel to envision an alternative to capitalist modernity without regressing to the finite logic of traditional society. So, like at this point, and I think later in the chapter, McGowan's is kind of gonna want to use this inspiration between finitude and the bad infinite to try and imagine the good infinity. I don't know if this is a problem that I have with Hegel, but I don't know. I don't quite understand. Like, I like the line in the circle. Yeah, that's great.
The bagel and the French toast?
Yeah, the bagel and the French toast. Like, how it actually plays out in anything more abstract or more concrete than that, I should say, I have like a much harder time with. So. Okay.
Neil, what do you think?
Yeah, I guess I'm thinking this out kind of now, and it's probably going to be extremely sloppy. But the bad infinite is just that. It's just this line that goes on forever. There is no end to it. And the good infinite is circular, and I think that kind of mirrors the way that McGowan thinks about the drive, which is kind of different than the way that I thought it. So I may be describing his perception or his perception of the drive incorrectly. If I am, I apologize. But he talks about the drive as this thing that always misses its object, right? You're always trying to get something, and you get close maybe at different times, but you never quite have it, whatever it is. You're always going in a circle and circling back around, trying to get it again, and then missing it again. And that process of repetition in and of itself, a very enjoyable thing for people. And that's one of the reasons why we're driven to repeat over and over again. I think that what he says though too maybe is that each revolution, each repetition going around is never precisely the same as the one before it. It's always a little bit different, and that is something that people get huge amount of satisfaction from. It's the whole thing, right? It's the whole going around, missing it, and coming back around and missing it again. That whole process offers something to us. And I think that that's really a huge part of what he's saying about capitalism here as well, is that capitalism has how, I guess in a sense, realized this about the human subject, that this is something that they do, and has really, no pun intended, capitalized on it. in a way. And that's one of the reasons why capitalism is so successful, is that it has kind of like inculcated itself into this very structure of the drive. And I'm like, that's interesting, because I tend to think of drive differently than that, but it's a really cool reading of drive, as opposed to this perpetual line that goes off forever and what.
Neil, I'm curious, in that reading, would you say that if like the circle is the good infinite, and that's kind of almost like the drive, is desire the bad infinite then, like the line that goes on forever? I'm just wondering, like, if there's some sort of parallel there
between, asking,
like
in my thoughts or in McGowan's thoughts?
Maybe in your interpretation of McGowan's thoughts. So both.
Well, okay. Let me pause here. So I think that this happened when I did an interview with Todd in the Inform podcast. I think we ran into some trouble at one point, because the way that I think about desire seems to actually be the way that he thinks about he uses the signifier drive for when I use the signifier desire.
Yeah, I remember that.
And so we had like this weird, kind of like the thing where we just were like, okay, you're using the wrong signifier. No, you're using the wrong one, or whatever. And we were like, well, to hell with it. Right.
Yeah.
And that was where we left it. So I think I'm kind of, for now anyways, and I could change my mind at some point. I've changed my mind on stuff a lot. So, but right now, my way of thinking about drive is that all drive is death drive, different forms of the death drive. And death drive is this repressed drive that all human beings have, and it is to destroy, right? To go back to this point of time before time, the time before you were born, the time before there was anything, and that we try back to that, and that becomes repressed, and because it's repressed, it plays itself out in some really weird ways. And I believe that having a desire, an object of desire, is something that can help slow down that death drive, that can act as a braking system to it. I don't think it can get rid of it. I don't think that anything can. But I do think it can siphon off some of the energy that the death drive would rely upon. And so the way that I think about this idea to kind of like go around and try it again and again, to me, that's very much like desire. And what would be the drive would be more like the straight line. It would just be the straight line but it would have a termination point. That's the other thing I would say too. It would terminate in some form of a singularity, which would be, the end of time. Not just the end of history, but the end of time, the end of everything.
Well, maybe on that note, I want to offer really quick my understanding of sort of the three core concepts here, the Hegelian concepts of finitude, bad infinite, and good infinite. So I think the whole point, kind of like what we're saying, is it's all about limits. Like, where is the limit set and where does the limit originate from? So finitude is primarily about external limits being placed on a phenomena or an object, or the development of an object. So basically death is sort of our finitude, right? That's an external limit. Basically you get murked by a Mi-24 or something, some sort of, preferably. But, basically like it's the idea of like your life is cut short by an outside limit being placed on it, like through death, right? But bad infinite is, the idea of the straight line that goes on forever. And maybe it has like a termination point and like a singularity or whatnot. But I think what's really interesting...
Does the bad infinite, how does it relate to, where's the limit at?
So I think the idea would... I guess the idea would be at least like postulates there is no limit. Like the line could go on forever, like to infinity. Right? Okay, but I think like what's really interesting though, and the reason why McGowan he names a chapter a more tolerable infinity, is the specific nature of the limit within a good infinite, which is it has to be an internally imposed limit. I actually think this is really interesting whenever we were talking about his reading of Marx, Neil, because my reading of Marx is actually Marx talking about ecological sort of development within capitalism and capital's relation to the environment as the only thing that's going to save us or to prevent full-on ecological catastrophe is a good infinite. Like basically there has to be some sort of situation where, and this is like a Walter Benjamin kind of idea of like divine violence or messianic time. It can't just be like a reversal of like the bad infinite, like back the other way. It has to be something that's like an internal imposition of a limit within the process itself, within the phenomena itself. And I won't get into like Benjamin because it's going to be about the nature of time and divine violence and stuff. That's for another episode. But I think that the key thing is that it's an internal limit that's imposed. And I think that's the difference. Like it's not an external limit, it's an internal limit. And I think this will be interesting because for McGowan, I think this has some I want to flesh out the implications of this in terms of the actual realm of political economy. Like, because I wonder like how he thinks about what does capital look like with an internal limit being placed upon it, if that's kind of what he's talking about? Or I don't know if I would say he's advocating for, but it seems like he's kind of talking about that. Like that's what we need, because capital thrives on a bad infinity at the moment.
I don't want to waste all of our time with dumb guy shit questions, but like
we are the real dumb guy shit podcast on the Lost Horizons network.
I mean, like I feel like this like distinction between the finite and the good infinite is sort of like the whether the limit is external or internal, right?
That's my reading of it.
And I mean, I don't know, they made this dumb question, but like I feel like when it comes to something like capitalism, like I don't know, like I think it's actually kind of hard to distinguish like what would be external and what would be internal to capitalism in some ways.
So maybe at the moment, what would you perceive as being an external limit to capital?
Some of the examples here, right? Like this is, I think the first one specifically that he talks about is
what page,
like,
John?
This is 138,
138,
right? Waste is a genuine barrier to capitalist expansion, but we can imagine ways around this barrier, such as perfect recycling projects that enable us to remain within the infinitely expanding capitalist system. And then he wants to talk about entropy, right? But let's say like, okay, waste. Waste would be, I have a hard time in that, like waste would actually seem to be an internal problem, right? So wouldn't that actually be an example of a good infinite?
I think it would be a good infinite if the logic of capital would somehow provoke a response where it would then limit production and consumption based on that waste.
Okay.
But I think the idea that like it finds a way around it is precisely why it's the bad infinite, because it's saying like, well, if it was an internal limit that was imposed.
Okay, gotcha.
Yeah, because it's the idea of like externalities and like economics, right? It's like, oh, like we call things externalities whenever it's like just brutal, like human and ecological destruction that capital causes. But, you know, they're just these things that are outside, and we'll find ways to continue pursuing profit in the midst of those things. So
it's basically like because we're able to find something, like it doesn't end up being a limit. It just becomes like was a potential limit there's like a solution to it.
Yeah, or like a non-solution, or just like something like that.
For the capitalist.
For the capitalist, yeah. That would be my read, yeah. Neil, what do you think?
So I want to make a comparison, I think, to do this. If we take a look at certain systems, like I'm going to talk about the legal system for starters. This is me stealing directly from Derrida when I do this. This is not my own thinking. So the legal system has something external to it. The law has something external to it, and that is the concept of justice. If there is justice, there is no need for the law, because we'd have justice. There would be no need to a system of law to bring it about. It would be here. If we take a look at a system like theology has God as this external thing to it. It's always talking about this thing that can't be realized, that exceeds the grasp of theology. It's outside of the system, because the system does have boundaries. It has limits. And, in the two examples I gave, justice and God are two things that default outside of the limit. But if you don't have that, then if that thing becomes internalized, if it comes into the system is done. There's no need for the system any longer. So what I think is interesting about capitalism is that it's a system that I don't think has any kind of like external limit like that. Nothing outside of itself. Because capital like this, it's like the thing in the John Carpenter movie, right? It just like everything it touches gets brought into it. There's nothing external to it. It's just seen as this thing that's kind of like expanding into infinite space with no internal nor external limit. And that's the thing that makes it so weird. That's the thing that makes it so monstrous and insatiable, right? Is that there isn't anything that it seems to have outside of itself. I mean, when I talk to libertarians, maybe sometimes I think they have this idea of like maximal liberty or something. It's sort of external thing, but I don't know if that's the thing that all capitalist thinkers kind of tie to or not. Anyways, I'll stop talking now because I feel like I've just said a bunch of garbage juice.
We're all just spewing garbage juice all the time whenever it comes right down to it. So Don, what do you think? I feel like I'm Joe Rogan moderating the presidential debate.
Yeah.
Jamie, pull that out.
No, okay. I think I'm like starting to get a better handle on it, I guess. I still like, so he moves on to entropy. So I would assume that so he wants to say, right, entropy actually does create this clear limit for capitalist expansion. Is that right? Yeah.
I believe so. Yeah.
He does say that. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Okay. I mean, would this, in a sense, because this is an external limit, would this then imply that capitalism is finite?
I think it's saying that capitalism is contained within the universe, and the universe is finite.
Okay. Yeah.
That'd be what I think he's getting at there. But capitalism might be this weird like psychosis that could believe, that it forecloses the second law of thermodynamics, and it's just like, now we're going to figure out a way to do it. We're, eventually through free market systems that are not constrained by any form of regulation or anything like that. The technocrats will build these satellite servers that are able to survive in total zero heat death of the universe things, and we'll just have our brains like stored on them, and we'll exist in perpetual simulation without any real worries or anything else like that, right? That's maybe the capitalist like psychotic idea. It forecloses the castration which is represented by and signified by entropy, or the second law of thermodynamics.
Like, I don't know, I feel like if I was talking to a capitalist and was like, oh, the second law of thermodynamics says that there's going to be an end to capitalism, I think they'd be like, okay, who cares? I don't know, I don't think that he's presenting it as if this is going to be like an argument that capitalists really care about. I think that maybe it goes towards like some argument about like capitalism's the naturalness of capitalism or something like that. But I'm kind of curious of why, or like what's the point of, how does it fit into this chapter? Because it just seems like I don't think I've ever talked to a capitalist that I think that actually believed that things were going to expand to infinity, like until the death of the universe. I think it was literally just like, that'll expand long enough until I'm dead. Like, I don't care as long as there's still growth in my lifetime. So
that is an interesting distinction, right? Because part of me does wonder if like, if you were to look at like an abstracted, like pure logic of competition and profit, right? And I think it's important we can't like separate capitalism from like Western like liberal humanism and like its ideas of progress as well. Because I think that in a lot of ways, like what is historically been an ideological justification for capitalist expansion across the globe has been through the ideology of progress. And so I think that, maybe on some level in a pure rarefied form, sure, like capital thinks of itself as breaking down walls, opening up new markets out of necessity because of the material limitations of consumption and production in like a specific region or a country. But it's like, I think that in a lot of ways, like most capitalists don't really operate on the pure rarefied logic. They operate on like just short-term maximization of profits to basically be like, well, as long as I maximize my profits while I'm alive, fuck the rest of the world. If everything's burning after I'm dead, I don't know. It's interesting to think about capitalist logic as like a pure abstracted, like rarefied form versus like what do capitalists themselves actually think, being the people who are sort of like the semblance of the system, is like we've talked about before.
Yeah, I wonder about that. Like, I don't know. Is there some kind of like fantasy of a post-death future, really, kind of present in capitalism, either in some kind of like sublimated, repressed kind of way? I wonder about that. Maybe. I'm thinking maybe lately, I guess I've been trying to understand accelerationism a lot more. And so I've been kind of diving into that stuff because, everybody needs a hobby. And that seems to be their idea, right? Is that humans are just like this bootloader for some kind of next level intelligence. And that the way that we're going to develop that next level intelligence is through capitalism. And so the best thing to, and I'm sure that there's accelerationists that don't think this. I'm not reading them all or anything like that. I'm not even reading the ones I'm reading all that seriously, but they seem to be suggesting that if you just took the brakes off of capitalism, we'd create Skynet, and it would probably kill off humanity, but that would be fine because humanity would have fulfilled its purpose, which is the creation of Skynet, which would be able to survive all of the environmental catastrophes that humans can't. And it would be just kind of creating the next form of sentient intelligence or some such thing, right? So maybe that's like poison to my mind or something like that, because that's what I'm very much thinking of.
It's poisoned many a good mind. Nick Land, come on, Red Library.
I feel like even the transhumanists who are like trying to become immortal, right? It's still only a immortality that lasts until like the universe is basically falling apart, right? Like when we talk about the heat of the universe, we're talking about a length of time that is just unfathomable to us. I think that when they talk about immortality, it's like maybe 1,000 years or something like that, like until you get stuck in a hole and you can't get out and stuff like that, and just stuck there for the rest of eternity. I don't know, like I don't think even the people who are like super transhumanists are like really talking about overcoming the heat death of the universe. I don't know.
I was gonna say maybe the best example of the bad infinite is accelerationism. That's a great example of the bad infinite right there.
I think it is. I mean, let me bring it back to the text, Podrads. This is on page 140. This is the last full paragraph before, was that jouir sans entraves? Whatever, my French, whatever. But he says, the limit that capitalism cannot integrate is that of the true infinite. This limit is internal, a self-limitation, and that's why I was defining that as like good infinite, is it has to be a self-limitation of the socioeconomic system itself. A self-limiting system, precisely what Hegel theorizes with his concept of the true infinite, is the only tenable alternative to capitalism. It doesn't pose an arbitrary limit that the capitalist system can quickly subsume, but clings to the limit as constitutive of the system itself. To subsume the limit thus becomes unthinkable. Yeah, like if you were to think about accelerationism is like just pure Chad bad infinity. That is exactly what it is. It's like, oh yeah, well, let's just kind of keep accelerating the contradictions until we get hyper machine-based fascism.
So nowhere in did you guys anywhere in this chapter get an idea of what he identifies as the internal limit of capitalism? Or is I
wanted to ask about this, yes.
Or is it like this is something that we need to, I don't know, I feel like if I think about a limit, it's something that should always be present, especially if, I don't know, like at least when I imagine the good infinity, if it's like a circle, right? Without beginning and end, right? Shouldn't the limit be there from theoretically the beginning or something?
Are you saying time is a flat circle?
Yeah, absolutely. That's what I'm saying.
Okay, I just wanted to double check.
I mean, it seems like he wants to say that this is how we get out of capitalism, and yet I'm not. It seems like he's not offering what that is, and I'm just kind of like, does it actually exist?
I guess I wanted to just throw out two things about this paragraph in particular. One, I do find it interesting that he doesn't offer any sort of name as the alternative to what it is, which does make me think that we could approach this two ways. One, we could think about an alternative to capitalism would somehow still be, if capitalism has an internal limit, is it still capitalism for McGowan? Because I almost get the sense that it's very unclear to me whether he thinks that it would really just be about imposing this internal limit, but that would, by its very nature, be a different economic system. I mean, I think that you could very easily say, well, I mean, okay, like aren't things like social welfare programs and like a bigger like welfare state like kind of an attempt to sort of like limit or at least like provide some sort of internal limit of like expansion of like corporations and monopoly power and or to redistribute the social surplus to the population in a more beneficial way. So I think that's one thing. But the other thing is like, I just have to wonder, it's like, well, how are we defining what capitalism is? Because at least in my understanding of capitalism, like it is by its very nature defined by markets becoming the dominant way that goods are exchanged and distributed and how production is set up, right? And like how profit is made and how value is defined. And so part of me is like what does the good infinite have to say about the nature of markets, right? And I know we had a whole chapter on markets, but I would just wonder like how to read these two chapters together.
Okay, so I don't know if this is going to work. We'll just give it a shot here. So I'm also on page 140. I'm going to read something from the book here. An investment in capitalism as a system demands an investment in the idea of constant expansion. Capitalism maintains its equilibrium not by sustaining a stable level of production, but through increasing production, without any notion of an end to this increase. When the capitalist system confronts an obstacle, say in the form of a crisis, the answer is always increasing production. The future will necessarily be more productive than the present, just as the present is more productive than the past. Reversals can only be temporary. So what I think is going on here, to kind of get back to what I think Don's original question was, I don't know that McGowan is actually ever saying that there should be an alternative to capitalism. I think even in the very beginning of this whole book, right, that's one of the things that comes up pretty clearly, is that he's not suggesting that capitalism be overthrown. What I think he's suggesting, and I might be wrong about this.
I was going to say, I mean, he does say that the only tentative alternative to capitalism. So he does use that phrase here. So that's only why I was saying it on the top of 140.
Okay, yeah, sure. What I think he's saying, though, is that alternative. It is not actually an alternative to capitalism. I think it's an alternative to the way that we recognize it. And this is a very psychoanalytic way of thinking about this. When somebody goes through a course of psychoanalysis, I think one of the things that happens to most people is they come in with some form of a fantasy, which they view the world through. And this fantasy is one of the things that makes the world tolerable for them. You look at the real through the lens of a fantasy, and looking at it through that lens allows you to see it without losing your mind and going batshit crazy like people do in H.P. Lovecraft stories. So I think what he's saying here is that what I just read there, that's about like constant improvement and setbacks only being temporary, that this is very much a fantasy. And rather than trying to get rid of this, what I think the alternative is recognizing this as a fantasy, not as a reality, as something that is a fiction that people have made up to make themselves feel nice about entropy, right? To cover over that. And what would happen if people were able to see capitalism not as the real, but as a fantasy through which they view the real? That would change things. And I think that might be what he's suggesting is the real revolutionary move, is getting people to alter the way that they recognize capitalism and what it does.
How would that change things, I guess?
Would this change consumers? I don't know how it would change things.
Okay. I mean, like, is it like the way that consumers are interacting, that they like, who would be changing how they interact with markets? Is it like people involved in production? When people start believing that some of these setbacks may be not just temporary, that capitalism may stop expanding at some point. Yeah, I don't know. I guess I just like have a hard time imagining that people would act that differently. I guess maybe this is the incredibly fundamental difference that McGowan and I have. So,
well, Don, I think you and I have talked about this a little bit in between episodes too. I think that in that introduction, from what I remember of McGowan's whole setup here, kind of like what you're saying, Neil, is he said that capitalism historically has been critiqued or challenged on two primary grounds. One, the moral grounds of like utopian socialism, of like early phases of anarchism and socialist movements, and then the other one was sort of like the historical materialist ground, or like political economic ground of like Marxist critique. And from what I remember, the whole idea is to say, well, both of these have obviously proved insufficient. Why is that? Like, what did we miss? Or like, is there a way that psychoanalysis can offer us something that maybe those other two critiques didn't grapple with effectively or didn't recognize effectively? I mean, I still read McGowan as trying to like say that this is the thing that all of those missed. To me, I guess I just don't necessarily, the question still does come then, like, in a way, it's almost like, this is like V for Vendetta, is how I almost read this critique, which is like, well, if we all recognize like capitalism operates in this way, or like, the system, quote unquote, operates in this way, what would the day of the revolution look like, where we all just stand in our mass and it's almost like the Bartleby politics a little bit that Zizek talks about, which, I mean, is it the idea if we would just stand up and say, I prefer not to? Is that kind of the politics or the response that McGowan is driving at here? Is this almost like fundamental disinvestment in the system on a mass scale? That's the only guess I have of like what kind of political implications his critique specifically would offer. That, because if you look at like the moral critique, right? Like the moral critique sort of political implications are to organize revolutionary parties, like to build communes, like to build alternative forms of society. Like the political economic one is to also like have revolutionary parties, like to engage in like building a workers' party, like challenging state power, So I guess I'm kind of wondering like, just sort of what the...
I mean, I definitely understand that vision of what a revolution would, or, like what, some reimagination of capitalism, or whatever we want to think about what McGowan is talking about here is happening. But I guess especially in like an instance like this, I don't see the vast majority of people in our culture as actually caring about capitalism not having limits, right? Like I feel like it's the people who think that way are generally the people who like are in charge of things, like like are the people who are in power. And I actually think that the vast majority of the people, workers, aren't actually that. I don't even know if most of them have even thought about whether capitalism just expands to infinity or not.
Of course they haven't. That's the problem though, right? Like what I think McGowan is suggesting is a psychoanalytic interpretation. Right now, the idea is that there is a lot of enjoyment in this perpetual cycle of going round and around again and again, and just assuming that it will never end. And a really interpretation will expose the fantasy as a fantasy. And once you've rung that bell, you can't unring it. I don't know what will happen, right? Like Adam said a second ago, will people just do this Bartlebian, I prefer not to continue to be a part of the cycle of violence? I don't know. They might not. But I don't think you're wrong at all, Don, to say that most people are not thinking about this. But that's what I think is part of what McGowan is saying, is if you could get them to, is that there would be some form of an effect here. I think of it, this isn't Lacanian psychoanalysis, this is a different school of thought. There's a guy named Christopher Bolos who wrote a book called The Shadow of the Object, where he talks about this. That's why these things called unthought knowns. The idea is that, everybody has these things. They're just things that they assume to be true, and they've never considering the fact that they're not. And what can happen sometimes is that people can all of a sudden have a moment where they go, oh my gosh, I just always thought that you couldn't do that. I've never really thought, why do I think that? And because therefore I've never tried. Maybe I should try. But that's a thing here. There's no, I think, straightforward thing there, right? If there is a straightforward way, I couldn't tell you what it is. I think it's always a weird kind of byproduct of something else that happens to get there.
I guess the question would be if the point is to provide an interpretation to sort of dissolve the fantasy per se, does that apply equally depending on someone's class position? Because I could very well see like a business owner or someone. Well, I got finger wagged.
Yeah,
I got finger wagged, Neil. What do you got?
You got Matumboed. It's not to dissolve the fantasy.
Okay.
That's not the point, right? The point is to show that it is a fantasy and to show how it's been constructed.
Okay.
And those are two very different things.
So what's the difference?
It's you don't. If you have a chair, you could put the chair in acid and dissolve it, right? Mm-hmm. Versus somebody understand what the chair is. That's probably a bad example. I'm going to use a different piece of technology. If somebody sees something, a new piece of technology that does something that they've never experienced before, and they just think it's magic, that's what goes on here. Now, you could just dissolve the piece of technology, and then, okay, it would be gone. But it's much more powerful to just sort of show the person oh, no, it's not magic. Let me show you how it works. And then once they have an understanding of the mechanics of it, the way it's been constructed and what it's been, and how that construction leads to its effect, then they go, oh, it's not magic at all. It's just whatever. And I think that's what he's talking about. I think that's a really big difference, though. And in my mind, that's what's so cool about this, is that McGowan isn't talking about a kind of revolution that just destroys or dissolves capitalism by throwing it in acid. I think he's just talking about getting people to see capitalism for what it is. Just that.
Okay, so let me ask you then,
I think
Neil.
that's so interesting because it's nonviolent.
Okay, so let me ask you then, Neil, would you describe that as actually more of a traversing the fantasy kind of intervention? The idea is to see the fantasy, but not dissolve it per se, but to be able to relate to it in a new way, or to sort of operate within it. Okay, I would agree. I think that's what McGowan seems to be getting at, is this idea of to change our relation to the way that the fantasy operates, for sure. I think that's a good distinction to make, for sure, and it is. I think it then hinges on what do we think McGowan is really getting at here. So Neil, let me ask you, I know you've kind of brought this up in past episodes, talking about nonviolence. I don't know, I want you to talk about that. Where are you coming from whenever you think about, it seems like nonviolent resistance to capitalism is something that's really primary or really key. Is that accurate?
I think that resistance to violence in general, for me, is something that's really important. And it might not be important to anybody else, to tell you the truth. I think it's probably not. I think that capitalism, one of many, many things that kind of perpetuates a cycle of violence, right? Mm-hmm. that it encourages it. It encourages people to do violence to one another, to themselves, to their environment, to all sorts of different things. And I think it does that by providing a reward in the form of jouissance, when people are violent in different ways. It feels nice. It feels really good to I don't know, having for dinner 2 nights a night. I did that. It feels really good to, yell at somebody and really make a point and just destroy them, in some kind of a argument or whatever. That feels great. I'm sure I could go on and on. There's all sorts of ways that it does. And in this, one of the things that happens is it's very zero sum, right? There's winners, there's losers. You want to be a winner. Being a winner feels good. Being a loser feels bad. People are afraid that they're going to be a loser, and so they buy into the cycle. People want to be, so they buy into the cycle. And it just keeps the engine of violence moving along. And I think it doesn't actually need to be that way, to tell you the truth. And so that's the that I'm trying to figure out. I don't know how to do that. I don't know. I have no plan. I have no secret that I could use here that I could say if everybody just thought this or did this or whatever, then we'd be able to break the cycle. But I want to try to break the cycle. That's the whole, I think, for me. That's why I do a lot of the things that I do. It's teach. That's why I do podcasts. It's to try to convince people in any way that I possibly can to have a nonviolence, as an object of desire that pulls the jouissance away from the death drive and the cycle of violence and puts it into something else. And so, yeah, I would say that's a hugely important thing for me. And that's one of the things that, I don't know, I find parts of that in McGowan's work, and I think that's why it's very to me.
Yeah, no, that makes sense.
And when we talk about this traversing of the fantasy, this is something that every person, every individual needs to do for themselves. Is that correct? Like, if we saw this happen at a mass scale, this would all be everybody kind of accomplishing this on their own, right?
I think people need to do it on their own, but I don't know. Maybe there is a way to do it on a mass scale, and I just don't know what that is. I wouldn't want to foreclose that possibility. Okay. Total tangent. When I was watching the HBO series Watchmen, and they were building like that weird tower thing, I thought that might be what they were going to do with that, was use that tower to like create some sort of like collective thing that would pull people's jouissance away from the violence of racism and reinvest it into something else. And I was like, I wonder like how they're going to do this, and will I like it, will I not? And that's not actually what ended up happening, so it didn't matter. I don't know if there's a way to do it in mass. I wonder, maybe, and I just haven't figured out what that is. Maybe it's a combination, like macro and micro level things. I think most things probably are a combination of those things. I mean, that's one of the reasons why I'm really interested in not just psychoanalysis, but also social work, is that I think that social work is one way that you can think about the bigger picture stuff. And Marxism, for that matter, too. But and psychoanalysis is a very two people sitting together talking kind of thing. Can it be used in broader ways? Maybe. I just don't know how. The
next part that I'm gonna skip a couple pages.
Yeah, do it.
But I wanted to talk, because I think that where this comes up again is when he's talking about the ecological movement, and this is on like 147 and 148, because this is again another example of where he wants to say that what we need is to find is this good infinite that kind of threads the needle between the bad infinite, which was like Nordhaus and Schellenberg's program, and then there was the finite, which was represented by Rachel Carlson's like Silent Spring. So Carlson is trying to put a external limit on capitalism, and then Nordhaus and Schellenberg. Yeah, it says I
found something that goes with this too.
Going to read this section from 148. This is talking about Nordhaus and Schellenberg. It says they will not just erect another limit that the capital will attempt to transcend, but their success is ultimately also what undermines this program. Rather than react against the logic of capitalism like the environmentalists they attack, they freely adopt this logic through their insistence on the wealth of possibilities for the future. In this sense, they produce an ecology even more in tune with the demands of capitalism. And then, then he wants to kind of say that, we need some sort of option between these two that is able to be a good infinite.
This is on page 150 that I'm looking at this. So there's sort of two parts of a paragraph that are kind of interesting. So if capitalism requires a limit to transcend, which it does, every introduction of a new limit will be inherently self-defeating for the would-be limiter of the market's reach. One must instead rethink from that the limit, what form the limit takes. By articulating the difference between the bad and the true infinite, Hegel anticipates the psychoanalytic understanding of how subject satisfies itself. Though the subject consciously imagines itself making infinite progress towards its goal of total satisfaction, it never arrives at this goal because the totally satisfying object only exists insofar as it is lost. When the subject successfully obtains the object it seeks, this object ceases to embody the lost object. Capitalism promulgates the image of the bad infinite and hides the inescapability of the true infinite. The concept of the true infinite was Hegel's way, given the conceptual tools available to him at the time of formulating the self-limiting structure of subjectivity. I think that's, again, another way to think about what I was trying to get at earlier, right? There's again that fantasy of I'll get the lost object. And I think what McGowan is saying is that what would happen if people realized what they were doing, that the getting it is not going to satisfy you. Fantasy that it will, but as soon as you have it, it will cease to be the thing that you desire, and you'll just want something different. What happens if that is somehow realized and actually integrated into the subject? Who knows? But that would be revolutionary if that were to occur.
I think Mari Rudy actually has kind of an answer to at least some way to think about that, which is like the recognition in some ways doesn't stop the seeking after the object. it's very much about how you start to recognize that certain objects do provide partial satisfaction without being total. Like, it restructures how you relate to objects, and it sort of allows you to distinguish between which objects are sort of like these ones that you seek after, like, but don't ever satisfy you at all, really, versus objects that have, and I mean, again, people take issue with her reading of this, but objects that have das Ding, objects that do have that sort of like aura to them. And that's what I really love about Mari Rudi's approach, is she's like, it's obvious that some objects do have that, right? They replicate the lost object, and they like affect us in a way that is very distinguishable from like just getting like the next fucking box of like sugary cereal with like a fancy new color on it. So I think like in a way, like that's why I like Rudi's reading of how to think about this, because it's a way that does say, like, it allows you to recognize whenever you are in the presence of objects that do provide you some measure of satisfaction, although it's not total. And I think for her, whether she would say that's like revolutionary on like a collective scale, maybe not per se, but at least on an individual scale, like I've actually found her reading of that to be like life-changing for me, which is, I don't know what else it means to talk about something being revolutionary at a subjective individual level if it like doesn't change your life in some meaningful way. So I don't know. I mean, that's maybe one way to think about what would it mean to recognize. It's like, oh yeah, like of course these objects aren't like, it's the pursuit of the lost object that I'm after. But if you recognize that, then do you then change your relation to objects as a whole,
So I think after this, he wants to talk some, actually just a page or two after the what you read, Neil, was to talk about death as that external limit, or like as a limit of capitalism. And he talks about Kierkegaard a little bit. Now I wanted to pick out a section from the bottom of 152. Although to be honest, this is another section that I understand how it relates to like infinity, what he's talking about here a little bit, but I don't quite understand how it all fits into the larger chapter. So maybe Phil could help me with that in a little bit. But at the bottom of 152, that last paragraph, but we need a reason to continue living and not simply to abandon ourselves to death. This is where we encounter the eternal. Another sentence or two later, this eternity is constantly present for us when we confront the decision of our existence. We face the burden of having to act and deposit the cause of our own act. In this act, we take part in the true infinite with no assistance from external sources. But capitalism relieves us of this burden of the true infinite by translating the existential problem into the question of survival. I actually thought that this sentence here, right, we face the burden of having to act and deposit the cause of our own act. In this act, we take part in the true infinite with no assistance from external sources. I particularly thought that that like last part of the sentence, with no assistance from external sources, was really important. Mm-hmm. But I would say that like I don't think he uses, and maybe I'm misinterpreting like what he means by this, but like he doesn't use a word like genuine or authenticity here. But at the same time, it feels like it's pretty similar. And like I don't know, I guess I'm just like a little skeptical that it's possible for us to either be able to remove external sources from like our decision making, and to think like to have some view of ourselves that's like pure. I don't know, like it just seems like a notion of the self that I can't really identify with.
It's a really interesting way to read this, because my reaction to that was like, oh, this is pretty straightforward, almost like Lacanian ethics of the real kind of stuff, which is like not so much about like genuineness or authenticity, but it's a way that kind of in a similar sense of our relation to the infinite, like how is it that one engages in like an actual more ethical act. And it's like, I think in Lacanian sorts of approaches to this, I think of like Joan Kopchak and like Alenka Zupancic, just like the idea is like the ethical act has to be the thing in which like the subject's own internal like limited places on itself is like what is by its very definition like what is ethical. Or it isn't like, well, there aren't such things as external limits. It's a particular way that you relate to those limits through the internal sort of relation to them. So I mean, it's almost like there's a reason why like Kantian ethics and like Lacanian sorts of like ethics of the real like get read together a lot, because I think the idea is that, again, it isn't like I'm doing this because this is the law. It's like I'm doing this because like to do this is this sort of like relation of myself to the law that is me imposing a limit on myself, or like engaging in an act or violating a law like through this sort of like incursion of the real, which is what makes me an ethical subject in a way. So
Okay.
I mean, I guess like you could maybe say, is that like also a way to talk about authenticity? I mean, I wouldn't necessarily say that. I just think it's like operating in a different domain.
Like when you read like no assistance from external sources, like what type of things are you imagining there?
Well, this is one of the difficulties with Lacanian ethics. It's like, you know, it's like what qualifies as an ethical act. I mean, we've talked about Antigone on this series before, right? And I think that Antigone is at least, you know, however she gets interpreted, like Antigone is sort of held up as like, this is an ethical subject, or it could be an ethical subject, you know, even if it's like self-destructive in a lot of ways. Neil, you have thoughts about this as like other examples of?
I probably do, but I'm having a hard time accessing them. Prompt me in a different way.
Shit. I only had one prompt. Is it possible to act without external, what does he say? External.
With no assistance from external sources.
I guess it hinges on what you mean by assistance.
Well, I mean, that's I guess that's like one. When you and I have a different reading of this, I'm like trying to figure out like, yeah, how does each of us read no assistance from external sources? Because I was reading it in like a very broad way. That's why I was kind of like, I don't know, I just don't really feel like we ever have like a truly like an act that is like truly like self-sufficient or something like that, you know. So
yeah, I will say I've read different critiques of this kind of approach to
I mean,
ethics,
just I guess to me, I read a phrase like that as being like very broad, and maybe he means something much more specific by that, and maybe he has a much clearer idea of what an external source compared to like internal sources or something like that. But
Neil, I don't know if that prompts you in a different way. So
I'm trying to think about it like right now, and it's a lot to think about. So we face the burden of having to act and to posit the cause of our own act. In this act, we take part in the true infinite with no assistance from external sources. I think what he's trying to say here is that one of the things that capitalism does is remove the fact that we are choosing capitalism, that we are choosing to live in the way that we are living. It's that whole there is no alternative Thatcher line. It's easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism. It makes it seem as though there's no choice to it because there's nothing outside the system. And what I think that McGowan is getting at here is that we take part in the true infinite with no assistance from external sources by relying on, well, sort of, I guess, maybe becoming more in touch with and aware of our own subjectivity. You know, the idea that we are subjects and that we can act otherwise. You know, it might not be an easy thing to do. It might be very difficult. It probably is very difficult. But that there's an idea of the possibility of there being something else. I'm going to get back on my hobby horse here and say the same thing with violence. Like, I think a lot of times people just sort of assume that if I don't participate in the cycle of violence, that just means I'll become its victim. You know, that there's no around that. There's nothing I can do other than participate. And there's an idea, I think, in this whole thing that we can get out, but that requires understanding the system differently, understanding like the limits of the system differently, understanding the way that the system functions differently, and all that. I don't know. I feel like straying away from Don's question when I answer it in this way, and I guess I'm trying to look at what I think of as like the spirit of it, as opposed to like the letter here. You know, of that particular sentence. I don't know if that makes sense. Does it?
I'll have to think about it some more, I guess.
I guess my read of that is
All
I think it's an allusion to, like a very complex way of talking about ethics in Lacanian analysis that is very much, I think, grounded in this Hegelian idea. So it's kind of like, to me, it's, you know, it's almost like a throwaway phrase that is like coming from whole lineage of like a particular way of thinking about ethics, you know? I don't know. It's like almost in a way, you know, I mean, it's a throwaway sentence about a whole like rich tradition of how to think about ethics. And so it's like, yeah, maybe it's just not super clear, you know, what exactly that means.
Yeah, I mean, it's sort of a shame because I feel like that this is like essentially one of the few places where it seems like he actually tries to give like a clear explanation of what he means by like good infinite or true infinite or something like that. Yeah, is in this part here. So that's kind of why I was like really trying to get a handle on it.
I will say, I think on some level though, I mean, if we're applying the idea of a good infinite as being, you know, the way out or the way to reorient ourselves towards capitalism as a system, I mean, it would make sense that like in some way, like the good infinite would be the sort of thing that capitalism obscures or blocks us from recognizing or being able to relate to in all these different ways. So it's like, you know, in the realm of desire, like capitalism, like forces us to relate to things in terms of bad infinity, like in terms of ethics, it forces us to relate to things in terms of bad infinity. So it's almost like, it's like him kind of, you know, maybe a little too quick